President Trump met with South Korea's leader today at the White House. This comes as North Korea fires 2 missiles amid joint drills between the South and the U.S. Correspondent Alex Hogan has details tonight.
Congratulations on your election. That was a big one.
The future of the South Korea-U.S. alliance in the spotlight as the newly elected South Korean President Lee Jae-myung visits Washington for his first in-person meeting with President Donald Trump. Lee quickly calling on Trump to establish peace on the Korean peninsula.
실제로 이 문제를 풀 수 있는
The only person that can make progress on this issue is you, Mr. President.
President Trump said he'd support a meeting with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un.
I'd like to meet him this year.
In 2019, President Trump became the first U.S. sitting president to step foot in North Korea.
Remember when I walked across the line and everyone went crazy? Especially Secret Service. But I looked in and I saw more rifles pointing at me than you could. There were a lot of rifles in that building.
This weekend, the North Korean leader watched as his army launched new air defense missiles testing their combat capability. The North reacting angrily after the U.S. and South Korea began military drills just across the border. The annual program includes field exercises, computer simulations, and a nationwide civil defense drill rehearsing air raids and evacuations. Back in the Oval Office today, the leaders echoed ambitions of working together in both defense and trade. President Trump has imposed 15% tariffs on imports from South Korea. Seoul has pledged to invest $350 billion in the U.S. Trump touted today's summit as a success.
Yeah, I think we have a deal done. They had some problems with it, but we stuck to our guns. They're going to make the deal that they agreed to make.
Tens of thousands of American troops are stationed in South Korea. Today, President Trump said he might inquire if the U.S. can get ownership of the land where some of the troops are based. Brett?
Alex Hogan in London. Alex, thanks.
For more on the ongoing trade talks, let's bring in Thomas J. Phillipson. He was the acting chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors in President Trump's first term. So the president of South Korea is coming to meet with President Trump at the White House. What's on the table there? Set it up for us.
Well, I think South Korea has basically given us a big chunk of foreign direct investment of $350 billion, which I think is the biggest part of this trade deal. And many times I think what's missed in these trade deals is not the tariffs, but the non-tariff activities such as foreign direct investment. Before this all took place in April and we started having these trade deals, foreign direct investment in the U.S. hovered around $200 or $300 billion yearly. We are 10xing that now with 2 or 3 trillion essentially coming in through these trade deals. Those are vastly important measures that are going to boost our economy, which are missed in just focusing on the tariff. And I think South Korea is kind of a poster child for that kind of issue.
The head of the Federal Reserve says that the tariffs are increasing costs, increasing inflation, and that we're going to see continued inflation over the next few months. How do you see it?
Well, I think, a lot of economists don't believe tariffs increase inflation. Inflation we think of as economy-wide increases that are reflected across the economy. If you have tariffs, which only are basically about 1% of consumption, if you look at the tariff revenue being around 300 or 200 billion, essentially, it's a very small share of the economy. But yes, prices might increase on those tariffs good, but that makes you poorer. If you buy other goods, you will basically lower demand for other goods that therefore decreases those prices. So inflation is a government-induced disease by fiscal or monetary policy. The Fed is partly responsible for the inflation we have by increasing money supply by roughly a third. But I think they're very misguided on the inflationary impact of tariffs.
What about India and Russian oil? India is a democracy. They are mostly our friends, but they seem to want that Russian oil. The president is leaning on them heavily to reduce or even stop buying it. Is that even possible?
I don't know how much headway is going to get there. I'm not inside the negotiation, but also China and India is the biggest buyer of Russian oil. What has happened is interesting in India. In response to the tariff pressure from the U.S., they're now lowering consumption taxes in India, sometimes from 28 to 18%, essentially. that is a big boost for U.S. producers in India. Essentially, if you don't tax consumption of U.S. products, essentially in your country, that will be a boost to U.S. producers. So in general, a lot of this trade activity, we focus on tariff at home, but what's really taking place in this trade activity is opening up more free trade for U.S. companies abroad. That's true in Europe, Canada, Mexico, and potentially also in China, depending on what happens.
The president announced that the United States government is going to take a 10% ownership stake of the Intel chip company. That's a novel approach. The president says it's going to be great for American taxpayers. Is it?
Well, here's the deal. I'm the first to be against, industrial policy. That includes the CHIP Act that handed out money to companies. And also, I'm obviously against the government owning shares in private companies in general. The thing that makes it unique here, which I think people are missing, is that essentially this trade of the 10% stake in Intel is undoing the CHIPS Act if we get out and sell those shares pretty quickly, because it's essentially CHIPS Act gave grants of $10 billion to Intel, which if we sell our shares, can get back roughly $10 billion. So that depends how long they hold on to the shares. If they hold on and the government get involved in the management of Intel, obviously that's not something I would favor. But if they sell the shares, we basically reverse the CHIPS Act, which I would be in favor of.
Here's what the president had to say about this deal on Friday.
They've had some bad management over the years, and they got lost. And I said, I think you should pay us 10% of your company. And they said, yes, that's about $10 billion. I don't get it. This comes to the United States of America. And I said, I think it would be good having the United States as your partner. And we do a lot of deals like that. I'll do more of them.
In an interesting political swap, I guess you could say, Republican Rand Paul is not in favor of this. He says if socialism is government owning the means of production, wouldn't the government owning part of Intel be a step towards socialism? Terrible idea. And yet the guy who is in the U.S. Senate as a social democrat, Bernie Sanders, he seems to like this. He says, well, here's what he says. Okay, he says, if microchip companies make a profit from the generous grants they receive from the federal government, the taxpayers of America have a right to reasonable return on that investment. Taxpayers should not be providing billions of dollars in corporate welfare to large profitable corporations like Intel without getting anything in return. So the arguing goes on in Washington, but Intel, it appears, is going to survive, at least for now.
Well, obviously I'm against the government getting involved in running private companies. I think most people who believe in free market think that's a horrible thing. I'm not a national security expert, so I don't know how much of a national security issue there is here. But even if there was, I think we could do it without ownership. But like I said, this is a unique situation that if these shares are sold before Democrats come back in, I hope, then we essentially undone part of the CHIPS Act, which I thought was a bad act to start with.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks very much for being with us. Thomas J. Phillipson, we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Story that developed over the weekend. South Korea says it's working to bring home hundreds of its citizens who were detained in an ICE raid on a Georgia auto plant last week. Madison Scarpino is in Elabelle, Georgia. She's got more. Hi, Madison.
Hi, Dana. South Korea has not been happy about this historic raid. So now it's acting quick to get more than 300 of its citizens out of an ICE detention center. The South Korean government says it made a deal with the U.S. and after finalizing some details, it plans to send a chartered plane here. And those hundreds of detainees, many who were searched and shackled, will fly back home to South Korea. President Trump is calling this a very interesting situation. He backs ICE, but says we should look into letting foreign workers stay here to train American workers.
If you don't have people in this country right now that know about batteries, maybe we should help them along and let some people come in and train our people to do, complex things. So we're going to look at that whole situation.
South Korea's foreign minister is reportedly planning to travel to Washington today about all this. But President Trump says this hasn't impacted our relationship with the key ally.
We have a great relationship with South Korea. Really good relationship. You know, we just made a trade deal.
This Hyundai mega plant has been touted as one of Georgia's largest economic development project, and that it's meant to train thousands of Georgians. Thursday's raid happening while workers were building an EV battery factory, and just that factory itself is an over $4 billion investment. So Homeland Security says everyone arrested at the raid either had crossed the border illegally, had expired worker visas, or was not supposed to be working on a visa waiver program. But we spoke to an attorney representing two of the people detained who tells us his clients were working here legally. Dana.
All right, Madison, thank you.
So former ICE Director Jonathan Fay, he's here to explain all this. Jonathan, good morning to you. How does a company like this get away with it or find themselves in this circumstance?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. You wouldn't think a large company like this with so much to risk would risk using illegal workers. And I think what's really interesting and important about this, you hear sort of the complaints of, that attorneys saying that people were here legally, but there was a federal judge that issued a search warrant for this. So that judge found that there was probable cause for criminal law violations going on there, mainly with the employers. And I think President Trump's response is quite interesting and important in that, we need to make sure people are here legally, and if we need American workers trained, we should do that too. It's a total common sense approach, but it's always an American worker first approach as well as American business approach. But this whole thing is very good as far as deterrence, because companies that are hiring illegal people are, one, putting American workers at a disadvantage. Also, they're putting American businesses that play by the rules at a disadvantage. So this raid was a great deterrent to ensure that people here are working legally. Illegal people aren't allowed to work, and businesses aren't allowed to profit from using illegal workers.
Well, I find it all intriguing. Dana and I were talking about this last week. Doesn't E-Verify supposed to make sure this doesn't happen? Or do you have a lot of people being paid under the table?
Yeah, I think that's probably what they're looking into. Like, how do these people get in here and get through the system? Are they paid under the table? Are there fraudulent documents being used? I think that's probably one of the things they're looking at, fraudulent employment documents, I-9s and things like that. So I think that's part of the investigation. And clearly they had a lot of information before going in, because you wouldn't go into an operation this extensive. They arrested, 475 people. So this was a massive operation, massive planning into this. So they probably had information that there were lots of violations, or potentially lots of criminal law violations going on there.
Jonathan, one more story I'm going to hit you with. Put the headline up from FoxNews.com. Here it is now. Cartel connection. Hezbollah and Iran exploit Maduro's Venezuela for cocaine cash. Now we're being told that the Venezuelan government will tackle the cartels off its own coast. What do you make of that, given the raid that we saw on a boat at sea a week and a half ago?
It just shows how effective that boat raid was on deterrence, because they weren't talking about this a week ago. And I think they know that President Trump is strong on this issue, strong on the cartels, and also strong on any nation that's supporting them. So this was really effective, and it's going to really embolden a lot of these other nations to stand up to the cartels also, because remember, under the Biden administration, we basically, in effect, turned over our southern border to the cartels. They had more power than a lot of these nations. So the tide has turned, but I think it's President Trump's not only strong action, but just a difference from the weakness and ineptitude of the Biden administration.
Okay, watching both those stories, find them very intriguing. Jonathan, thanks for coming back today. Nice to see you on a Monday. Thank you. Dana.
Also breaking tonight, a major U.S. ally sees a massive political struggle. The South Korean president declared and then lifted martial law today. The parliament there in South Korea, which opposes him, voted to defy him. Military personnel were deployed and then withdrawn. Correspondent Stephanie Bennett tells us what this is all about. Good evening, Stephanie.
Good evening. Yeah, South Korea's president says that he will now lift it less than 12 hours after imposing it. Now, this reversal comes after the country's parliament had voted to reject it altogether, which would have given the military unlimited authority to make and enforce laws. Take a look at some of this footage we saw from earlier outside the South Korean National Assembly. A heavy police presence was on the ground and in the air to try and keep the peace as crowds continue to grow. Many protesters yelling, quote, "No to martial law and strike down dictatorship," and at times we saw people attempting to force their way into the building. Officials inside barricading those doors with furniture. But then, moments after President Yoon announced he would lift martial law, well, people outside started to celebrate and troops withdrew. Since taking office in 2022, President Yoon has struggled to push his agendas against an opposition-controlled parliament and has also faced low approval ratings due to various controversies and scandals. Just this month, he denied wrongdoing in an influence peddling scandal involving him and his wife. Well, President Yoon said the decision to declare martial law was necessary to protect the country's freedom from, quote, North Korean communist forces. Well, the country's main opposition party leader condemned the move, calling it unconstitutional, and quickly called on lawmakers for an emergency late-night vote, where 190 of 300 members in attendance all voted in favor of lifting martial law, forcing the president to back down. South Korea, of course, is one of the United States' most important strategic partners, and there are thousands of American troops currently stationed across the country. But we're also getting a new statement from the National Security Council saying, "We are relieved President Yoon has reversed course on his concerning declaration of martial law, and democracy is the foundation of the U.S.-South Korean alliance."
Our alliance with the Republic of Korea is ironclad, and we're fully committed to that.
Yeah, and the last time something like this happened in South Korea was in 1979. And at last check, just within the last hour, we have some lawmakers who are now looking to impeach the president, while you have others who are hoping that he will step down. Brett?
Stephanie, thank you.